Okay. Well, let's get started. I want, along with my co-organizers, Eileen Applebaum and Brad Hirschbein, to welcome everyone to today's convening of the Outsourcing Research Network. Those of you who attended our January convening may remember that towards the end of the meeting, we were having a really lively discussion about the relationship between outsourcing and automation. There was a lot of interest in pursuing this further, and so that's the subject of today's convening. I want to thank Janet Vertesi of Princeton, who will be leading us off today with a presentation of her new co-authored paper on platform companies and evidence that they have that these platform companies are outsourcing while simultaneously developing technologies to automate jobs. Steve Vaselli of the University of Pennsylvania and Sue Helper, who is on leave from Case Western University at the Council of Economic Advisors, are then going to provide some brief comments on Janet's paper, along with how it relates to their own research. We should have plenty of time for open discussion following these presentations. Brad Hirschbein and I will be monitoring the chat function. So please type in any questions or comments you have there. And just to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end for discussion during these presentations, please limit the questions to ones that simply seek clarification. So with that, let me turn it over to Janet.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I'm here to represent this co-authored paper along with my esteemed colleagues at Princeton Sociology. And I just want to mention them briefly because it's the combination of our expertise actually that we brought together on this paper from a sociological perspective. So I'm Janet Vertesi, Associate Professor. My expertise is in science and technology studies and also organizational sociology. My colleague, Assistant Professor Adam Goldstein, works in labor, socioeconomics, and organizations. Deanna Enriquez is our graduate student who's an expert in freelance labor and gig work. And Larry Liu, also here on the line, is an expert in automation and labor and economy. And Katie Miller, a very talented undergrad who worked with us as well. So we're coming at this problem with this shared interest in labor, economics, organizing, and technology, and with these many different streams of sociological literature behind us to advance this conceptual argument. So I'm going to begin with the story that opens the paper, which is an evocation of what we mean when we're talking about pre-automation. I was living in New York City in 2014 when we got the news that Amazon had bought a warehouse in central Manhattan, right at basically right near Penn Station, essentially, 34th, and that they were busy coding up an app that would allow you to order anything to be delivered to your door within 2 hours. And this was tremendously exciting, of course, and they rolled this out through the course of 2014. At the end of 2014, you indeed could order anything to come to your door within 2 hours. Amazon also hired a whole bunch of delivery workers, largely on foot, actually entirely on foot. And this was surprising because New York had a very lively courier service expertise. There were lots of people who drove, lots of people on bicycles, and there was a lot of expertise there in how to navigate the city. But Amazon was just interested in anyone who could walk. And by 2015, they'd rolled it out across the multiple boroughs of New York City and began to expand it. But there is a parallel story of what was happening at Amazon in that period in 2014 that is usually not told at the same time. And this has to do with aerial drone delivery services. So in December of 2013, CEO Jeff Bezos went on 60 Minutes and announced that Amazon was working on drone delivery. At the very same time as they were configuring the Prime Now 2-hour delivery service, purchasing the warehouse and coding the app, Amazon was at the very same time investing in scaling up and hiring into its drone delivery service to Prime Air. And they were submitting something like 90 patents towards drone delivery at the same time. So usually these two stories are told separately, that Amazon has this whole automation thing going on, and then Amazon has this whole, we want to have packages in 2 hours thing happening. But we think it's really important to tell these stories at the same time because they represent a concerted effort by a singular company to scale a service that is delivered basically on foot, in this case, by individuals at the same time as they're investing in automation and replacement. And that's the core element of pre-automation we want to advance. So I'm going to begin today with a little bit of conceptual development because this largely is a theory-oriented piece, although it does have some empirical data. And I'll draw then on our firm case studies, largely Amazon and Uber. And then I'll talk a little bit about the role of the pre-automated workforce and conclude with some implications specifically for our thinking about outsourcing labor and automation. So first, what is pre-automation? Here is your definition. We define it as the coincident effort, simultaneous concerted effort, to scale a workforce via platform while simultaneously investing in its automated replacement. So companies that will spin up a sharing economy gig style service at the same time as they are busy working on automating that service away. Pre-automation represents what we see as a strategic configuration. It is a strategic configuration of people and machinery, and it is also strategically oriented towards a shared imagined future, one that the company hopes will allow them to capitalize on this built-out network by producing a largely platform monopolistic system. Now here in Imagined Future, we're drawing on the work of Jens Beckert, an economic sociologist, who describes how under capitalism, firms need to have a shared future orientation that they're all working towards, because that rationalizes and justifies the kinds of decisions and investments they're making in the present day. Those futures can shift, as we will later discuss, but the key element here is that this movement towards this shared future is what justifies the kinds of strategic configurations of people and machines we currently see in this particular element of the gig economy. We want to argue that this represents potentially a new way of thinking about automation as well as outsourcing. So on the one hand, we typically think of automation as something that comes in later, as exogenous to the firm and is brought into the firm later on, and once labor costs get too high or the workers start agitating towards unionization, et cetera, that there's a bunch of reasons why a firm might then invest in technologies that are externally produced. But in this case, we see firms invest in those technologies internally in order to produce a largely outsourced workforce. And the outsourcing thing here is really important because it enables firms to spin up this networked service and then to orient it towards insourcing. So normally we think about the development of a core service and then outsourcing that in order to save money, in this case, and to increase profits. And in this case, companies are using outsourcing first in order to then eventually insource and bring those core functions back into the firm as automated techniques. So in our intervention, then, we're weaving together 4 streams of literature broadly in this area. The first is the empirical studies of gig work, which have given us an idea of what it's like on the ground, how people participate in the gig economy. We're particularly inspired by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri's work on ghost work, which looks at these invisible laborers that perform tasks that are essential to artificial intelligence, but are largely abstracted away from the consumer. In our case, we're actually looking at cases where these workers are front and center. They are frontline. These are the people delivering your packages to your door. They're very evident and very visible, and they are strategically being deployed while the firm is automating in the background. To that end, we're speaking to the literature and the dynamics of. Is this a question? Sorry, can you, if you're not already muted, can you? It would help if you did so. Thanks. So we're also speaking to the literature and the dynamics of outsourcing that looks at this, the fissured workplace, the increasing outsourcing of these jobs, the kind of good jobs, bad jobs idea, and contributing here with another element that's important to understanding what we see in the outsourcing job arrangement as oriented towards a larger arc, a dynamic that's again oriented towards total capture by the firm. And we're speaking to the literature and platform monopoly, particularly monopoly capitalism, because the role of outsourcing in this arrangement is to enable the development of a monopolistic network towards the capturing of those rents of the network as well. And I'll describe that a little bit more as we go along. And then we're speaking to the futures of work literature. And here I put futures with an S in parentheses, to indicate that there are multiple different ideas about how this could go. Either technology is liberating us from our work, or it is, the robots coming to take our jobs. Whichever side you're on, the sociological stance is it's going to be a lot more messy than that and more complicated. One of the complications we argue is that the future that what we're currently observing is not the future of work. That companies are working towards a future that they share as a vision for what that work should look like. And what we're seeing right now is a staging apparatus on the way towards that future. So to that end, to summarize then, pre-automation then is intentional and it is endogenously produced within the firm. It is strategically oriented. The actions of the firm using the gig platform include the scaling of the economy, the capturing a market, deregulating in certain instances of that market economy, producing the data traces and the analytical background in order to fuel automation, and reducing risk through the use of outsourced workers. The goal, again, is to build a monopoly that you can build a platform monopoly through the efforts of your externalized workforce. And the externalization of that workforce is extremely important, not only because it keeps the costs low, the cost of worker hours, as well as the cost of investment in network externalities, but also because the outsourcing allows you to deploy a low-skilled labor force and make that largely difficult to detect in employment records, as I'm sure many of you here are very aware. Although we'll describe today 2 moments where we think we can see this process in action. And then ultimately, pre-automation is a largely aspirational process. For those of us that study organizations and technology, we know that when new technologies come into the workplace, there is not as much like loss of jobs as there is reskilling. Technologies cannot so much replace the complex tacit knowledge that humans have about how to do their work, than they do sort of complement or work alongside. And so we see this is going to be a much messier future, and I'll speak to that as well. So I mentioned this is largely a conceptual piece, but we do have some empirical methods. We spend a lot of time digging into the Bureau of Labor Statistics data and the US patenting database, as well as correlating patenters with LinkedIn profiles and with employment histories, examining public filings of these companies. And then we also conducted a series of interviews with drivers, about 40 of those, and spent a considerable amount of time observing driver forums online, and then also combing the tech media space as well. There's 2 pieces that I'm not going to report on today, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if we get to that. So let me look at our case studies. I already described the Amazon example where Prime Now was launched. It was initially envisioned in the spring of 2014 or early summer, it was like June of 2014. By October, they had the warehouse. By December, they rolled it out. Of course, at exactly the same time, Amazon is investing in patenting and developing its aerial drone delivery service. And this was so successful for Amazon, they did it again. They did it again twice. The first with the Amazon Flex platform for delivery services, which they began in 2015, which was basically Prime Now, but for driving. And they had expanded that to 11 US cities by 2017. By late 2017, Amazon began what they called their Delivery Service Partnership Program, which allowed individuals to begin a franchise in which they would then, acquire those vans with, Prime written on the side that come and deliver your packages. And then people could then take on the risk as micro entrepreneurs of then hiring other individuals into the firm. Now, of course, this path doesn't run entirely smoothly for Amazon. They run into trouble, especially in California, as Prime Now drivers are getting reclassified. Are they employees or not? But largely, this is what's happening on the gig side of things. And yet the automation side of things is not silent. So by 2014 sees 94 patents filed for autonomous vehicles. 2016 sees a similar number, but with 16 additionally for automated vehicles as well. So just as Amazon is pulling out Flex and beginning to start this delivery service partnership program, they are also investing in acquiring the technologies and companies and services towards autonomous vehicles that will presumably take the place of these individuals on the road. And these 2 things are not, it's not like the right hand and left hand don't know what each other are doing. By the end of 2017, Amazon placed the same senior vice president in charge of both delivery service partnership and autonomous and aerial vehicles. So this is happening at the same time within the company. It's a very kind of unified thing. I should note Amazon is a very large company. They are doing a lot of things at the same time, but the proportion of their patents that are dedicated to drones that are filed and approved grows to just around 7% or so, and then including an additional percent that is oriented towards autonomous vehicles. What we also think is interesting is we can see some traces of this as an activity in Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So we see a consolidation of delivery and courier establishments towards the end of 2017. And this is, of course, as Amazon is trying really hard at this period to vertically integrate basically all of its logistics and delivery services. So they don't have to give money to UPS anymore. They don't have to contract out. So we're starting to see towards the end of 2017, as there's more and more demand for package delivery, UPS is the market is really consolidating around UPS. But just as the Delivery Service Partnership Program gets introduced in late 2017, we start to see a skyrocketing number of courier establishments compared to the kind of variation we'd seen before. And at the same time, we're also seeing a larger number of statutory employees. Like this number basically doubles by 2019 vis-a-vis 2015. And of course, there's a large demand for packages and same-day delivery, et cetera, at this time. But to a certain extent, these two upticks at the same time look to us like the introduction of this franchisee program with the expansion of a number of employees that are actually visible in employment data, largely because the franchise network is considered an employment opportunity. So we do see some change in the workforce. Let me move over then to Uber, which is another classic example we'd like to argue of pre-automation in action, but they work a little bit differently than Amazon. Amazon has a considerable resource base to draw on with which to begin things like Prime Now and Flex and Delivery Services Partnership and Prime Air simultaneously. Uber has to wait a little while. It begins in 2009. Right at the height of the economic recession. By 2013, it's expanded enough, has enough capital to expand to Europe. Of course, again, the course of Uber never runs smoothly. There is a lot of fighting back from taxi drivers around the world and from different cities. They forge ahead with Uber pooling and multiple drivers, et cetera, until about 2017 when the CEO was forced to step aside. We see a lot of agitation towards unionization, et cetera. Now, of course, the thing about Uber is it looks like it's a ride-sharing platform, but really all along, Uber is a self-driving car company where their innovation is that they are going to replace or sell cities self-driving taxis in order to make the money back on investment. In order to do that, they have to kind of take out or deregulate the taxi industry. And this is what the role of the pre-automated workforce is. So by 2014, the CEO lets it slip that actually what they're really interested in is self-driving cars. And a lot of this comes to light a little bit later on as they have the battle with Google over a series of patents that were initially transferred early on. By 2015, they famously hire 50 roboticists from Carnegie Mellon. They begin self-driving car tests in Pittsburgh. They have more and more autonomous vehicles on the road. They start to acquire self-driving truck companies like Otto. This is also when the patents that are contested become shifted over to Uber, and they do a bunch of really fun and interesting things with offshoring their patents, et cetera. But by 2017, they have $384 million invested in research oriented largely towards self-driving cars. So this has been a considerable part of Uber's strategy. And we note that by 2016 and 2017, the early patents were acquired in 2015. But by 2016 and 2017, patenting for self-driving vehicles makes up about 50% of Uber's submitted patents that are approved. And that is a considerable amount of corporate investment in this particular strategy. We also are able to detect some elements of this shift when we look at the taxi and limo industry. And we see this in a simultaneous decline in numbers of employment in taxi and limousine, but also a spike, an inverted U spike in wages. And what we want to argue here is it's not like taxi drivers are suddenly making more money. There's fewer of them and they're making more money. But rather that the spike we see here, which is really a tripling of weekly wages over this 5 or 6 year period, is because the tech workers are moving into the sector. So what we see is a compositional shift in the taxi and limousine industry as the industry is pre-automating and they bring in these laborers who cost a lot more to employ. So we would be interested in looking for other signs of this kind of spike, pre-automation spike, as we look at labor stats for other industries as well. Okay, so I want to say here for a second that not all automation is pre-automated. We still see a lot of traditional automation out there where companies buy things off the shelf from elsewhere. Also, not all gig work or sharing economy or platform work is pre-automated either. A lot of it is, but Airbnb is not pre-automating, right? There's no moment where Airbnb is suddenly going to make everyone's hotel, robotic or anything. But this is a very specific pattern that we saw in the last 10 years emerge out of Silicon Valley that we argue plays an essential role in platform monopoly capitalism. And we argue that it does so in several ways, largely through the deployment of this externalized outsourced workforce, which we argue is engaged in a form of infrastructural labor. So what the pre-automated workforce does, what these outsourced laborers do for these companies, is enable them to build towards monopoly in several ways. The first is that they scale the platform for the company. They are the frontline workers for expanding into new markets. They subsidize that expansion by investing in capital equipment such as cars and vans. Sometimes Uber also makes, or the companies make money off of them because they're renting or leasing the cars and vans from the company. So it's another opportunity for profit. They establish consumer demand and also worker demand in a variety of different sectors. And you might ask, why then, with all this activity going on, would a company aim to self-disrupt? And largely it's because of the prospect of monopoly profits once this network has scaled to a certain extent. And that justifies the local capital expenditures that are essential in trying to automate this network away. Another thing that the workers do is they take on risk for the company. So first, they take on the cost and risk of accruing the network externalities that are essential to scaling the network. And they do so with materials that are about to be obsolete, right? Say you want to roll out self-driving taxis to a whole city, the last thing you want to do is buy non-automated taxis in order to get your foot in the door. You want to be investing in the automated vehicles, not the non-automated ones. So if you allow the gig workforce to invest in this equipment that's otherwise going to be obsolete, you basically you can erase that from the bottom line of your company as it's expanding. These workers also act as frontline deregulators. So they help shift the regulatory environment and they enable a form of market capture for these companies. And we see this as people argued for, and lobbied New York for the opportunity to drive for Uber or Lyft. We also saw this in our network ethnography with many of the online forums where many of the drivers we observed were farther on the right of the spectrum, were more Trump supporters, but were also very interested in saying, like, this is an entrepreneurial opportunity. I don't want this regulated. So in many ways, the drivers are arguing towards the benefit of the company's ability to scale. And they also serve as the public face of the platform. These are the people who are driving for us. This isn't ghost work that's ghosted away to some other place that we do not see. The automation is the thing that's what we don't see. What we do see are these individuals. And so they become the public face of the platform that can argue for its opportunities moving forward.
Janet,
at the same time,
Janet,
yes. Mm-hmm.
Why don't we just pause and take two short clarifying questions from first David Weil and then Jeff Parker.
Yes.
You want to go ahead and unmute, or I could read?
Sorry, I can't see the questions, Yeah,
no. Okay, I'll read.
Thanks.
So David said, what is the relative scale of investment over this period in the two arms for each company? For example, Amazon's investment in R&D for drones versus building out Flex DSP networks.
I can't answer that off the top of my head. I'll have to go back and look at the numbers. We don't have it necessarily for Amazon. I do have it for Uber. Okay. And but I don't have it offhand. It's a good point. What I do know is it does represent a substantial portion of their activity.
Okay, and then Jeff Parker asks, given the low margins in the industry, the valuations might be viewed as making bets on exactly automation or Uber is investing.
So
that's more just a comment, Susan.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm just saying, hooray! Really enjoying the talk.
Oh, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, no, people are taking bets. I mean, they're especially as they're trying to acquire a lot of different companies and a lot of different opportunities. They are kind of trying to take bets on which one's going to move forward.
Great.
We can too. Sure. So the third part of infrastructural labor that these workforces are engaged in is a form of taskification and data servitude, basically data serfdom, where the purpose of these workers as they move around with their phones in the world is to feed the system with data, with real-time data about what they encounter as they move around in the world. And what this means is that they can they not only provide the data that's used to train AI and used to train algorithms back home, centrally in order to automate, but they can also trial run the logistics for tasks that will ultimately return in-house under these automated regimes. So the purpose is to, give them the opportunity to run these tasks and see what happens, bring that data back home and use that in order to improve the algorithms and improve the services. So the workers then become a kind of real world testing environment for these algorithms in development. And one of the things we learned through our interviews is that people noted the moments when the system had clearly updated or they brought in some new tool or some new algorithm or some new technique that they kind of had to now incorporate and work around, which never really fully captured the kind of work that they felt they needed to do, but was clearly happening at the same time. So this is really important for the production of this job as a taskified unit, as something that is tractable for an automated technology to achieve. Now, interestingly, when we spoke to the workforces, when we spoke to people themselves, they did not really perceive this, with one or two exceptions, they didn't really perceive this as a threat. And that was for three reasons. One was we largely, we managed to recruit across the United States, but also in lower socioeconomic status respondents. And so many of them were working multiple jobs at the same time. And they were just like, look, I just don't have time to worry about this. I'm just, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm just making money for tomorrow. But a bunch of them also did this really interesting thing where as soon as we asked them about self-driving cars towards the end of the interview, they kind of pivoted and there was a change in their voice and a change in their stance. And they started to talk about it as if they were the consumer and not the person whose job was about to be replaced. So here's an example. Do you worry about self-driving cars? I'm not worried about that. Why not? Because technology is just expanding. I feel like we're all just like, we're crash test dummies. They're going to have to recall something. And this is the point where we start realizing they're talking about recall. Like this is really a consumer thing. Like they think they're the crash test dummy, like in the passenger seat or the driver's seat. Okay, well, if Lyft told you, this was a Lyft driver, they were trying to automate, would that make you nervous, right? Oh, are they going to try some self-driving cars? Well, if they told me that, I wouldn't join. I wouldn't go for it. I don't see myself in one of those. So again, this person doesn't see themselves as the person who's going to be replaced. They see themselves as the consumer, the person who's, in the passenger seat, et cetera. So when we saw this happen frequently as people kind of shifted modes. And the other thing they did was they talked about how, as we kind of pushed them about this, they talked about how there was no way their job would be able to be automated away because it was too complicated for a machine to do. So here's another example. Do you worry about things like self-driving cars? No, I don't worry about them. If they were a threat, I don't know if they're really a threat. I mean, if I've seen those drones and this, that, and the other, it sounds good, but the drone has to know which package to take and stuff. And, I tell you, some of these people do not make it easy for you to get to their doorstep, right? So again, a kind of pushback that's associated with the limits of automatability and the importance of worker expertise. And it's precisely these kinds of narratives that demonstrate two things. One is the kind of impossibility of the dream of the imagined future of full automation, which we would know very well from studies of technology and work. But the other is the distance of these workers' narratives from the core narratives of the firm. The way that the work is talked about within the firm and the way that automation is talked about in the firm is actually quite distant from how these workers experience their jobs. And that's largely a function of that outsourcing externality relationship where these workers are very external to the firm, importantly so. But it also means that when we just study the workers and not necessarily the firms themselves, we're going to miss a whole series of these dynamics that are explaining or rationalizing the way their work is right now. And that's why we think this attenuation to pre-automation as a strategic configuration remains important. So to remind you, this is an imagined future. It's not promised. It's not essentially going to come to pass, although certainly people are working very hard to make sure that it does. But instead, it is a very powerful narrative that's driving the kinds of configurations of work that we currently see. And to that end, I'm going to outline or conclude with 4 implications for this community in particular. The first is a way of thinking about outsourcing as a form of staging for insourcing. So instead of this classic way of thinking that we have this core competency that then firms, spin out, that instead pre-automation gives us a rationale for using an externalized workforce that we then ultimately want to capture monopolistically and create as part of internally to the firm, but without having to pay for those workers, by being able to replace them with, with machinery. So this adds a new layer to why individuals might choose an outsourcing arrangement and also places outsourcing in a much more dynamic arc oriented towards the future of the company. And so for those of us that are interested in looking at labor data, we might look for those moments of compositional displacement or major change in wage, et cetera, to see when these kinds of outsourcing arrangements are happening that might be pointing towards a pre-automated arrangement. Secondly, that automation is not endogenous, that automation is not exogenous, that it is endogenously produced. So in this case, companies are investing internally in the systems that will replace these laborers. And it's ironic here that the labor is outsourced and the technology production is insourced, being done internally, because it's an inversion of how we usually think about outsourcing and automation. But again, as I've mentioned, the prospect, the promise of the extraordinary return on investments, once this platform monopoly comes to pass, it is instantiated in the way that these individuals, the people in charge of the companies dream it will, justifies this investment in this short-term, short-lived outsourcing arrangement as a way to build out that network. Of course, the question is whether or not this will be, maintained, whether or not it will actually come to pass. And what we've noticed is that companies are really in a race against the clock with their workers to get to the point of automation before the workers start to find each other, organize, agitate, start to look for political processes through which they might receive different kinds of treatment. And the companies that we've looked at have failed in that regard. We see also this sense, this is the last slide. So an additional element here is that the future, when we talk about the future of work is not really supposed to be what we're currently seeing. The companies that are building what our technological future is going to look like are using this as an intermediary stage towards a dynamic arc that's oriented towards a more automated future. And so when we think about things like the future of work, we need to think about the jobs that we're currently observing as kind of a permanent beta position. Like, this is an opportunity. They're constantly being reworked, the algorithms are being tweaked, and the individuals are sort of trying out the system before or to enable the automated capture of this job. And so when we think about the future of work, we really need to bring in these series of outsourcing and automation and the dynamicism between the two in order to understand what we're currently seeing as a particular configuration, like as a stage on the way towards that ultimate envisioned future. And that future is just envisioned. And here I want to return to the notion of the imagined future. Again, Speckert reminds us that in moments of exogenous shock or environmental change, companies have to pivot very quickly. And that when things are not working, companies will have to choose a different future orientation towards which they will work. Under COVID-19 in March 2020, we saw massive shifts in the workforce, a huge drop off of requests for this kind of service, especially from places like Uber. And we saw Uber sell off its self-driving car company. We also saw Uber have to make a claim that their workers were core to their business by 2019 by their new CEO, which was a real shift away from the prior statement that there was no way Uber could survive if they had to take these individuals as employees. Of course, at around the same time, sometime late last year, Amazon actually just went out and bought a self-driving taxi company. So, it's not like the pre-automation dream is entirely gone. We're not sure what's coming next, but certainly we know that in a period like COVID-19 era, that change is a constant and that the future will have to change with it. Still, what we hope we've been able to identify is a configuration of work and labor that is oriented towards a form of automation that we believe is really central to the kind of platform monopoly capitalism we've observed in the last 10 years from Silicon Valley. With that, I'd like to, again, thank my co-authors and recognize my co-authors for their equal contribution. And I'm very excited to hear the comments and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janet. That was terrific. Let's turn it over now to Steve Vaselli.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I really just love this paper, and I found it so thought-provoking, Janet. And in particular, the potential research areas for thinking about the process of scaling and risk shifting, and this intersection of outsourcing and technology, I think is particularly interesting in terms of refocusing and leading to new research efforts. But what I particularly like about the overall impact of this on in the areas that it does make me think more is really in centering these firms, both in terms of the intent of automation and the power, right? And as I'm reading, automation literature all day long now, and thinking about this, so much of this is portrayed as, technology is the actor, right? So much of what is happening in the development of technology is portrayed as a natural process, right? Or a market-driven process that is fairly organic, when in fact, right, so much of this is really about the strategic action and planning of particular firms who are either developing this technology and intending to sell it to other firms, right, or developing it internally. And even when that development is happening outside of firms, from what I'm seeing in my work on self-driving trucks, there is a need, right, to correspond to those internal futures, right, that are being imagined by the customer's firm. So if we look at self-driving trucks, and I think this leads to an important distinction that I would like to see in more of the literature, right, between sort of the technology development that is really being done by public monies in universities and government versus that in private development. In the case of drones and in self-driving vehicles, we had decades of government investment in these technologies, right? And then a very short period of a few years in which the attempt to commercialize them, at least for self-driving trucks, was not directly linked to those end-use consumers or the end buyers of it, which would be the manufacturers. And so I think it's real. This paper is great in that it is centering the action with these private firms that are going to decide whether or not to adopt. A couple points that I think this made me think about in relative to my own work now is that the more I get into it, the more I realize that what this outsourcing and technology is doing in these two fields is not simply trying to capture an existing market, right? We often compare to taxis or to UPS. And the more I get into this, I realize, Uber and Amazon are trying to create two really new kinds of markets, right? They're commodifying two broad areas of activity, personal transportation and shopping. And what they're doing is they're taking the labor we're doing for ourselves and trying to, pay somebody else to do it, right, and find a profit in there. And I think they're really two very different paths forward for them. For Uber, automating driving is essential. It is, as Kalanick said, way back when, it is existential. There's, cheap taxi service is already pretty cheap. And people don't really use it very much. I would guess the average American probably, is as likely to fly in a year as take a taxi, right? So they really need to drive that cost down in order to replace personal transportation, right? And so getting rid of those labor costs is really critical. I think for Amazon, there's more potential for the automation to be, and so I would say, first of all, on Amazon and on Uber, I think we're, rather than pre-automation in many cases, we're looking at partial automation. So they've already automated out a number of jobs like dispatching, load planning, and things like that in both of these. The potential for productivity enhancement in goods movement is just inherently greater than in personal transportation to residences and lots of places where people take cars. So I see, this essentially so far as a de-skilling kind of technology. When we compare the UPS drivers to the Amazon drivers, they've essentially de-skilled the route planning and sort of task planning that the drivers are doing. And as they begin to increase the density of these deliveries, right, as we get, from packages, drivers delivering 250 to 300 packages up to 400, which is what we saw during COVID, and more. I think, that as that wage goes down relative to the amount of packages that you're delivering, it's just going to make sense to keep that human there. And I agree with a lot of, what they're doing in terms of data gathering, et cetera. But in the end, I think there's this paradox, right? Because, they're creating a cheaper and cheaper labor force, right? Which is then going to compete with the technology in a sense, right? It's got to be cost effective relative to a, cheaper and cheaper labor force. And so there is that paradox in there. For the case of Uber, I think it's a no-brainer. You have to have, in order to sort of be, profitable long into the future, they're going to have to get rid of that human labor because it can't really be made more productive. On the package side, I think there's lots of opportunities for productivity growth, and that technology, just from the more I talk to the engineers, is just going to be incredibly expensive. I mean, these robots are going to have to do very complex tasks. Self-driving vehicles are going to be relatively cheap compared to current vehicles, right? At least that's the expectation, is that they're going to cost, $10,000 more or something like that than a non-self-driven vehicle. The cost of a robot who could go out into a neighborhood and deliver hundreds of packages, right? Get over curbs and negotiate all kinds of environments that are unplanned for its work, right? These things are going to cost, I would assume, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And right now, Amazon's employing 500,000, low-wage workers to do that. And those robots are going to have to be cheaper, right, than those 500,000. That would be a massive capital investment. So I think, so I'll wrap up there. I think just a fascinating, thought-provoking paper and set of case studies here.